The restaurant had always been busy, but that evening felt different. Maybe it was the noise, maybe it was the crowd, or maybe it was the mix of people who seemed to arrive with short tempers. The waitress moved from table to table with a quiet smile, trying her best to keep everyone comfortable. She wasn't loud, she wasn't the type who liked attention, and she certainly wasn't someone people looked twice at when she walked by. Most customers barely even looked at her face. They just wanted their food, their drinks, and fast service. She had been working there for months. Every day felt almost the same: take orders, bring plates, wipe tables, repeat. But she didn't complain. She needed the job, and it kept her going. What most people didn't know was the girl behind the apron had a whole world inside her. A world full of music, dreams, and feelings she rarely shared. She had learned long ago that people judged too quickly. They looked at her uniform, her simple hair, her quiet voice, and assumed she didn't have anything special to offer that evening. A group of guests walked in with loud laughter that wasn't warm. It was the kind that made others uncomfortable. They took their seats at a large table near the middle of the dining room. Even from a distance, the waitress understood what kind of group they were. There were people who came in ready to enjoy themselves, and there were people who came in ready to complain about everything. She could already tell which category this group belonged to. She approached them with her usual calm expression and asked what they would like to drink. Before she even finished her sentence, one of them waved his hand as if shooing her away and said, "Just bring us a menu first." "You're too slow." Another laughed under his breath, and the rest joined in. She didn't react, but inside she felt a small sting. Still, she nodded politely and walked away. As she moved around the restaurant, she overheard them joking about her. They said she didn't look like someone who could handle pressure, that she looked confused every time she repeated their order. They didn't know she remained calm, not because she was weak, but because she refused to respond to negativity. She had learned that sometimes silence was stronger than arguing. The restaurant had a small piano in one corner, something many guests didn't pay much attention to. It was used on weekends by a hired musician, but tonight it sat alone, untouched. The waitress often looked at it while passing by, not because it was shiny or because it had any special decoration, but because it brought back memories she kept locked in her heart. She used to play at home almost every day. Music had been her escape, her comfort, her safe place. But life had changed. Responsibilities came first, and she no longer had time to sit and lose herself in melodies, but the love never left her. Even when she wiped tables or ran from one order to another, songs played quietly in her mind. Sometimes she would tap her fingers against her tray, creating rhythms only she understood. Her coworkers occasionally noticed, but nobody thought much of it. That night, the loud group continued making comments. When she returned to their table with drinks, one of them smirked and pointed toward the piano. "Hey," he said loudly, making sure the people at the tables around him heard. "You ever touch that thing? Do you even know what a piano is?" The others laughed again, not because the joke was funny, but because they enjoyed mocking someone who couldn't talk back. She felt her cheeks warm for a moment, but she remained composed. She set the drinks gently on the table and simply said, "Is there anything else you'd like?" Her tone was soft, respectful, not shaking even though she felt embarrassed. Another person in the group leaned forward and said, "You don't look like someone who can play any instrument. You probably can't even play a simple tune." Their laughter grew louder, filling the room in a way that made other diners glance over with confused expressions. She didn't respond. She just nodded again and stepped away, but as she walked, her eyes drifted once more toward the piano. Something inside her stirred a quiet feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, something that came from years of loving something silently. One of her coworkers approached her near the counter and whispered, "Ignore them. They're just being rude." She gave a faint smile, but the thought of the piano kept echoing in her mind. She hadn't played in so long. Life had become so busy that she almost forgot what it felt like to let her fingers glide over the keys. A few minutes later, she passed by the piano again. She wasn't planning to stop. She wasn't planning to do anything unusual. She was simply walking by, minding her work, when one of the guests from the loud table shouted across the room, "Hey, waitress, why don't you play us something? Show us what you've got." Again, laughter followed. She paused. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she realized she was tired of always being underestimated. She didn't want applause. She didn't want attention. But she didn't want to keep hiding either. All her life, she had been the quiet one. The one people didn't take seriously. The one who did everything right, but still went unnoticed. Her coworker gently said, "You really don't have to do anything." The waitress nodded, but her eyes softened as she looked at the piano. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. She didn't hear the laughter. She didn't hear the clinking plates. She didn't hear the impatient voices calling for service. All she heard was the silent invitation of the instrument calling her back. She slowly walked toward it. A few customers noticed and whispered among themselves, wondering what she was doing. The loud group watched with smirks, expecting a joke, expecting her to embarrass herself, expecting something to laugh at again. But for the waitress, this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about remembering who she was before life became heavy. She reached the piano, placed her hand gently on the back of the chair, and took a slow breath. Everyone around her kept talking, unaware that something meaningful was about to happen, something quiet, something simple, something that would change the atmosphere of the entire room. She pulled out the chair, sat down carefully, and looked at the keys. Her fingers hovered above them for a moment, as if greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. And in that small second, before she even played a single note, she felt a strength inside her that she thought she had lost. The restaurant continued buzzing, but a few people stopped eating, sensing something different. Her heart beat softly, not from fear, but from a deep connection to the thing she loved most. The moment her fingers touched the cool surface of the keys, something shifted inside her. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't something the room noticed right away. It was quiet, like a small spark lighting up in a dark place. She didn't press any key yet. She just let her hands rest there as she took a slow breath, trying to steady the mix of emotions moving through her. She could feel her heart beating, but not in a nervous way. It beat in a familiar rhythm, the kind she used to feel when she practiced alone in her small room years ago. Back then, she didn't care who listened or who didn't. Music was simply a part of her, something that lived in her hands, in her thoughts. And in the quiet moments no one saw, around her the restaurant was still busy. People talked loudly, forks clinked on plates, chairs slid across the floor, and orders were shouted from the kitchen. But the noise felt distant to her now, almost like she was sitting in a separate world. The piano created its own small space around her, blocking out everything else. She didn't rush to play. Instead, she let herself remember why she loved the piano in the first place. Memories floated back, afternoons spent practicing until her fingers got tired. Mornings when she would wake up excited to learn a new tune. Nights when the rest of the house was sleeping and she played softly to calm her own thoughts. Those memories didn't feel far away anymore. They came back to her like they had been waiting all along. Behind her, a whisper rose from a nearby table. "Is she really going to play?" Someone asked. Another voice replied, "Probably not. She's just pretending." The loud group that had mocked her earlier leaned forward, watching her with amused expressions. They clearly didn't expect anything impressive. They thought she would hit a wrong note, panic, and quietly walk away. Maybe they even hoped for that because it would give them another reason to laugh, but she wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't thinking about proving anything. She was thinking about the gentle lessons life had taught her, how sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply be themselves, even when others don't take them seriously. Her coworker stood by the counter watching with worry. That coworker knew how sensitive she was, how deeply she felt everything, even if she never showed it. They kept hoping she would get up before the group said something cruel again. But she stayed seated, calm, almost peaceful. Finally, after what felt like a long stillness, she pressed the first key. It was a soft sound, not loud, not sharp, not dramatic. Just a single note that floated gently into the air. but it was enough to make a few heads turn. Something about the way she played that one note made people pause. It carried emotion, the kind that couldn't be faked. She pressed another note, then another, her hands moving slowly at first. She didn't start with a fast tune or anything showy. She began with something simple, something warm, something she felt deep inside. As the first few notes formed a melody, the noise in the restaurant started to soften. Conversations grew quieter. People began to look over, wondering what was happening. Her fingers moved with a grace she didn't have to think about. The keys felt familiar under her touch, as if they were welcoming her back after a long time apart. She leaned slightly closer, letting the music guide her hands. Every note felt honest. Every movement felt natural. The loud group, the ones who had laughed at her earlier, slowly stopped smirking. A few of them exchanged confused glances as if they couldn't understand how the same girl they joked about moments earlier was now creating something so beautiful. The waitress didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the piano, pouring her feelings quietly into the music. She wasn't smiling, but her expression had softened. She looked peaceful, more peaceful than she had felt in a long time. Playing the piano didn't make her feel powerful. It made her feel like herself. As she played, the melody grew fuller. Her hands moved more confidently, flowing from one key to another. She remembered the notes not because she memorized them, but because they lived inside her. They came from years of practice, from moments of joy, from moments of sadness, and from everything life had taught her along the way. A few tables away, a child tugged on their parent's sleeve and whispered, "She plays so nice." The parent nodded, surprised by how quickly the atmosphere changed. The restaurant had been filled with loud chatter just minutes earlier, but now it felt calmer, almost like everyone was listening without meaning to. Her coworkers stepped closer, their mouths slightly open in amazement. They had always known she was quiet, hardworking, polite. But talented? This was something they had never imagined. The manager walked out of the kitchen, wiping their hands on a towel. They looked around, confused by the sudden hush in the dining room. When they spotted the waitress at the piano, they stopped in their tracks. The manager had heard many performers play on that piano before, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the raw emotion in her playing, or maybe it was the unexpectedness of it all. The melody became richer, deeper. She didn't rush. She didn't force anything. She let her heart guide the tempo. Each note seemed to tell a small story, one of hope, one of patience, one of hidden strength. For years, she had held herself back. She had worked quietly, served politely, stayed in the background, and avoided drawing attention. She never wanted to inconvenience anyone or make anyone look at her longer than necessary. She thought blending in was safer. But sitting at that piano, she realized she wasn't blending in anymore. And for once, she didn't want to. The group that mocked her earlier sat frozen. One of them whispered, "Is this for real?" Another shook their heads slowly, unable to hide their surprise. The laughter had disappeared from their faces. They didn't look amused anymore, they looked speechless. The melody began to shift, becoming a little brighter. Her fingers danced lightly across the keys, almost like they were telling the room, "This is who I really am." She didn't look up, but she could feel the silence growing in the space around her. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a listening silence. Some diners leaned back in their chairs, letting the music wash over them. Others rested their elbows on the table and watched her with soft expressions. Even the kitchen staff peeked out from behind the door, curious about the sudden change in mood. But inside her, the biggest change was happening quietly. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: self-connection. She felt seen, even though she wasn't looking at anyone. She felt understood, even though she hadn't spoken a word. Every note she played carried years of unsaid feelings. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Her music did it for her. Her hands moved with confidence now, flowing softly across the piano like they belonged there. She wasn't thinking about the rude comments anymore. She wasn't thinking about the people who underestimated her. She wasn't thinking about the long days and tired moments. She was thinking only about the music, and as she played, she realized something important sometimes. Life gives you a small unexpected moment, a moment that lets you step out of the shadows. And if you're brave enough to take that moment, even quietly, it can change everything. Her fingers reached the final notes of the piece. The soft ending floated into the air like a gentle breath. She let her hands rest on the keys for a moment, letting the music settle in the room. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Everyone just listened to the silence she left behind, the kind of silence that only appears after something meaningful has happened. The last note was still floating in the air when the waitress slowly lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, she didn't move. Her breathing was soft, steady, almost peaceful. She didn't look around yet because she wasn't sure what she would see on the faces of the people sitting behind her. She had played purely from the heart, without thinking about anyone's reaction. But now that she had stopped, reality slowly returned. The restaurant stood completely silent, something that had never happened before. Not even during slow evenings. Forks were frozen in mid-air. People who had been mid-sentence hadn't finished their words. Others leaned forward with their elbows on the table, staring at her like they had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. She finally turned her head a little, just enough to see the nearest tables. What she saw surprised her. Instead of mocking faces or sarcastic smirks, she saw quiet eyes full of awe. A few people had their mouths slightly open, stunned by what they had just heard. Couples who had been chatting before now looked at her with gentle expressions, as if they were seeing her for the first time, but the group that had laughed at her earlier had the most noticeable reaction. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't looking at each other with smug expressions. Their faces looked shocked, almost confused, like they were trying to understand how the girl they had teased moments ago had just filled the entire restaurant with a performance that didn't sound ordinary at all. One person in the group leaned back slowly, eyes still fixed on her. Another rested their hand on the table, shaking their head slightly as if trying to process the moment. The person who had made the first rude comment earlier now seemed embarrassed, staring down at their drink. The waitress looked away from them and back at the piano. She didn't want to make them uncomfortable, nor did she want to make them feel guilty. She had played because she needed to, not because she wanted to prove anything. But seeing their reactions made her realize how powerful honesty could be, how music, played with real emotion, could touch even the people who didn't expect it. She stood up slowly from the piano seat. The sound of the chair moving was the first noise the room had heard in a while. As soon as she rose to her feet, the silence broke not with chatter, but with applause. Soft at first, and louder, then filling the entire room, people clapped with genuine appreciation. Some even stood up. A couple of guests near the windows looked close to tears, touched by the raw feeling in her music. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to attention. So she simply gave a small, polite nod and placed her hands together, almost as if thanking them for listening. She didn't bow dramatically. She didn't try to look confident. She just acknowledged their appreciation with the same quiet humility she carried every day. Her coworker rushed up to her, eyes wide, speaking in a whisper because they didn't want to interrupt the moment. "I didn't know you could play like that," they said, almost breathless. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" She gave a tiny smile and said softly, "I just never got the chance." It wasn't a lie. Life had been busy, and she never wanted to seem like she was showing off. Besides, she never imagined she would play in front of strangers in the middle of her shift. The manager approached as well, moving slowly as if not wanting to scare the moment away. They looked at her with surprise and admiration. "That was unbelievable," the manager said. "You played like someone who performs for a living?" The manager wasn't exaggerating. The emotion, the smoothness, the depth, it didn't sound like a hobby. It sounded like someone who had spent years practicing. The waitress didn't know how to respond, so she simply lowered her gaze slightly and said, "Thank you." The loud group hesitated before reacting. Eventually, one of them stood up and walked toward her. Their shoulders were a little tense, their expression awkward. When they reached her, they scratched the back of their head and said quietly, "We didn't know you could play like that. We were wrong to make fun of you." The waitress gave a soft nod. She didn't hold anger in her heart. She didn't want them to feel ashamed forever. She just wanted respect. "It's okay," she said gently. "It happens." The person looked relieved and returned to their table. The group didn't talk loudly anymore. They didn't joke or tease. They sat quietly, thinking, reflecting, humbled by what they had just seen. But the biggest change wasn't in the group. It was in the waitress herself. As she stepped away from the piano and returned to her work, she felt different. She felt lighter, more confident, more connected to herself. Something inside her had opened a part of her she had kept hidden for so long. She realized that she didn't have to live in silence anymore. She didn't have to shrink herself just because people didn't see her. She had something special inside her, something that deserved space. As she took new orders and delivered plates, customers spoke to her with new warmth. Some complimented her softly, telling her how beautiful her playing was. Others said they hadn't expected someone so quiet to have such a powerful gift. A few even asked her if she had ever performed anywhere else. She answered all of them politely, though part of her felt shy. She didn't know how to handle compliments. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Still, their words felt comforting, like a gentle encouragement she had needed for a long time. Across the restaurant, people continued whispering about her performance. Not in a gossiping way, but in a surprised, touched kind of way. Someone near the back told their friend, "Her music didn't sound like practice. It sounded like real feeling." Another person said, "She must have a story behind that. You don't play like that unless the music means something." As she continued working, the manager came to her again. "I've been thinking," the manager said. "We have live music on weekends, but sometimes the pianist cancels or doesn't show up. If you're comfortable with it, maybe you could play here on weekends?" The waitress looked up, surprised. She had never thought of performing publicly. She had never imagined playing for a room full of people who actually wanted to listen. The thought made her nervous, but also excited. "I can try," she said softly. The manager smiled warmly, the kind of smile that made a person feel appreciated. "Only if you want to," they said. "But I think people would come just to hear you." The idea settled in her mind like a quiet seed ready to grow. Later that evening, after the rush slowed down, she found herself glancing at the piano again. This time she didn't feel nervous. She felt thankful. That piano had given her a moment she didn't know she needed. A moment that showed her she wasn't invisible. Customers leaving the restaurant gave her small waves or soft smiles, something they had never done before. They had seen a part of her that she never thought she'd share with strangers. They saw talent, emotion, heart, not just a waitress taking orders. She realized that sometimes life surprises you in ways you never planned. One moment she was being teased, underestimated, treated like she didn't matter. The next moment she had changed the entire mood of a crowded room with nothing more than her honesty and a melody she loved. That night, as she cleaned the last table and prepared to close, she felt something she rarely felt. She felt proud. Proud of her courage. Proud of her talent. Proud that she didn't walk away when others tried to belittle her. She walked past the piano one last time before leaving. She placed her hand on the wooden frame gently, almost like thanking it without words. She knew she would return to it again. She knew she would play again. And this time not in hiding. The cool night air touched her face gently as she stepped outside the restaurant. For a moment she just stood there, breathing in slowly. The sky was calm, the street was quiet, and she felt something inside her shift in a way she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't excitement and it wasn't fear. It was something softer, something like a quiet belief in herself that she hadn't felt in years. She wrapped her arms around herself. Not because she was cold, but because the moment felt delicate, like a small flame she didn't want the wind to blow out. All evening, people had seen her in a new light. The respect in their eyes, the softness in their voices, the way they looked at her as though she had become someone different. It stayed with her, but deep down she knew she hadn't become someone new. She had just allowed the world to see the person she had always been. As she walked home, she kept replaying the moment she touched the keys. It felt as real now as it had when she was sitting at the piano. She remembered how the first note sounded, how everything in the room had slowly quieted, how the melody flowed like a story she had been waiting years to tell. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the night. Her heart was still full of the music she had played. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the piano keys, heard the applause, felt the warmth of people's appreciation. She wasn't used to being noticed. All her life she had moved quietly, doing everything with care but never expecting praise. She had learned to be satisfied with silence. But now something was different. This time the silence felt full, not empty. The next morning she woke earlier than usual. She didn't understand why, but something inside her felt new. When she walked into the restaurant for her shift, she noticed something strange. People weren't just greeting her out of habit. They were greeting her with genuine warmth. Her coworkers smiled at her in a way they hadn't before. One of them playfully nudged her and said, "Our hidden star is here." Another said, "If you play again today, I'm recording it." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "It wasn't anything big," she said. "It was," one of them replied. "You changed the whole atmosphere last night." When the customers started arriving, many recognized her. Some waved, some nodded, and some smiled at her as if they were meeting an old friend. It was strange but warm. People who had never looked at her before now looked at her with appreciation instead of impatience. By the afternoon, even the manager couldn't stop mentioning her performance to new guests. "You should have heard her last night," they told someone. "She made the entire restaurant silent." The manager wasn't exaggerating. Everyone had seen it. And then something unexpected happened. A guest approached her during lunch hours. They held a phone in their hand and said, "Is this you?" She leaned closer and saw a video on the screen. It was her sitting at the piano, playing with her eyes down, hands moving gently across the keys. Someone had recorded her without her noticing. She felt a little embarrassed, but also curious. The video had thousands of views, thousands. She didn't know how to react. Her heart fluttered with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "I didn't know someone filmed this," she said softly. "It's going everywhere," the guest replied. "People love it." More people approached throughout the day, showing her the same video from different accounts. Some were edited with subtitles, some with soft music added, some simply showed the raw recording of her playing. Comments were filled with people saying things like "unexpected talent," "this moved me," and "why isn't she performing somewhere bigger?" She felt overwhelmed, but in a gentle way. She wasn't chasing fame. She didn't care about becoming viral. What touched her the most were the comments from people who said her music made them feel calm, or comforted them, or reminded them of something in their own lives. In the late afternoon, the manager called her over to the office. She walked in nervously, wondering if something was wrong. But when she entered, the manager wasn't angry. They were smiling. "Sit," the manager said kindly. She did. The manager took a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about what happened last night, and about the video going around today." She stayed quiet, unsure of what was coming next. "You have something rare," the manager continued. "Not just skill, but heart. People felt something when you played. That doesn't happen every day." She lowered her gaze, unaccustomed to receiving such deep praise. "So," the manager said, leaning forward slightly, "I want to offer you something. If you'd like, you can perform here every weekend. Not just as a backup, as our main performer." She blinked, surprised. "Me? Yes, you," the manager said with a warm tone. "I know you're shy. I know you don't like attention. But if you feel ready, I think this could be something beautiful." She felt a tightness in her chest, the kind that comes when a dream you never allowed yourself to imagine suddenly becomes possible. She had never thought of performing for others. She had never believed people would want to listen to her. She always assumed her music mattered only to her, but now she wasn't so sure. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she said quietly. The manager answered softly, "You've already proven you are." She looked up, and the manager smiled gently at her. It wasn't a pushy smile. It was encouraging, respectful, patient. After a long breath, she nodded. Okay, I can try. The manager clapped their hands softly in excitement. Good, we'll make a small announcement for the weekend. Nothing big, nothing stressful. Just a warm evening where people can enjoy your music. She left the office with her heart beating warmly. She didn't feel scared. She didn't feel pressured. She felt ready. That evening, when she walked home, everything looked different. The city lights seemed softer. The street noise felt friendly. Even the cool breeze felt like it was quietly cheering her on. She felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She thought about the rude comments from the group. The night before, the people who doubted her, teased her, underestimated her. She realized something important. They were not the reason she played. Their poor behavior didn't give her strength. Her strength came from her love for music, from her years of practice, from her quiet courage, but they taught her something valuable sometimes. Life places doubtful people in your path not to hurt you, but to push you into showing a part of yourself you've kept hidden. When the weekend finally arrived, she walked into the restaurant with a calm heart. The piano looked different now, not like a decoration, but like a friend waiting for her. Customers filled the tables, some new, some old, all waiting for the same thing, the quiet girl who surprised them. With a melody that came from deep inside her soul, she sat at the piano, took a soft breath, and let her fingers touch the keys again, just like the first time. But this time, she didn't feel small, she didn't feel invisible, she didn't feel underestimated, she felt seen. And as she played the first soft note, the restaurant grew quiet once again, not out of shock, but out of respect, out of admiration, out of love for the gentle strength she carried in her hands. The melody rose, warm and full, touching every heart in the room, but most importantly, it touched hers, because she finally understood something she had always struggled to believe. She mattered. Her talent mattered. Her voice mattered, and she never had to hide again.